In the name of God, Creator, pain bearer, and Spirit of life. It's pretty obvious to our 21st century ears that these statements of Jesus about hating family are hyperbole. Hyperbole. We've all used it. I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. Well, that's hyperbole. And some will even add, and chase the rider. I've heard that said. Of course, it's not factual, it's not real, but it's a hyperbole. It's over the top. Of course, Luke is using hyperbole, and he's using the word hate in a somewhat different context than we are already imagining. It just makes no sense in the context of the gospel to hear Jesus telling us to hate anyone, let alone our own families, because Luke's Jesus has been teaching that we should love even our enemies and respond in love and forgiveness when we are abused. That's something. That being the case, it makes no sense for him to suddenly do an about-face and tell us to hate our own families. So what's he trying to tell us, to teach us? This is not hate as being an absence of love, for love is the very antithesis of hate. Nothing is sadder or more tragic than to watch two people who have loved each other marry and have children together, then separate in an acid cloud of acrimonious hatred for each other, often using the children in devious ways to hurt their ex-partner. It's a horrible aspect of human nature. That's ugly. That's hate. And it's evil. Hatred is far more than simple dislike. We all make almost unconscious judgments about people when we meet, don't we? Some we immediately warm to and feel comfortable in their company. Some we are ambivalent about, nothing negative particularly, nor nothing really positive either. Neutral. Whilst with some we get the immediate feeling of repulsion, even dislike. We're perhaps polite, but will not contemplate any further relationship. But that sense of alienation is a far cry from out-and-out hatred. That is something else again, another level of human emotion. What Luke is getting at here can be summed up in the word compassion. Compassion is not the absence of dislike or even hatred, but the overwhelming, undeniable summons from the Spirit of God to engage in acts of love and justice. If one's focus in life is narrow and introspective, if one accepts a narrow view of family and values one's own life and lifestyle more than the justice and love of God, one will not take risks for the most vulnerable in society. One will not privilege the justice and love of God above social position, wealth, celebrity, self-aggrandizement, and applause. Interesting, there's a strong undercurrent of sentiment running through the Australian people that engages with this propensity to self-aggrandizement. It's called the tall poppy syndrome. Peter Hartcher wrote in the Sydney Morning Herald, Australian citizens know that some among them will have more power and money than others. But according to the unspoken national ethos, no Australian is permitted to assume that he or she is better than any other Australian. How is this enforced? By the prompt corrective of levelling derision. It has a name. It's the tall poppy syndrome. The tallest flowers in the field will be cut down to the same size as all the others. Now, this is sometimes misunderstood. It isn't success that offends Australians. It's the affront committed by anyone who starts to put on superior airs. I believe that this is what Luke is addressing here. Look back for a minute. You remember in Luke's story, Jesus has just left the banquet that was given in his honour by a leader of the synagogue. We were talking about this just before the service. We read of the behaviours of some of the guests who were seen to be jostling for places of honour at the table, supposing to be better than they really were, to be higher up the social ladder than they were. And we read of Jesus' response. These are not the poor and marginalised, those on the fringes of society. These were the upper classes, the well-off, the well-to-do, the tall poppies. It doesn't take much imagination for us to see them in our own society. Generally speaking, capitalist free market Western societies tend to encourage greed over giving, hoarding over sharing, and overabundance as a marker of social status over the elimination of poverty. Jesus' admonition that the travelling crowds relinquish their possessions is a challenge to reject greed, hoarding, and overabundance for the sake of overabundance, and is in favour of sharing with a view to the alleviation or even the hopeful elimination of poverty and its effects. He's not saying, don't become wealthy. It's not the wealth he addresses, it's what you do with it. Qantas boss Alan Joyce had a pay rise in the last financial year, taking his annual salary to almost $2 million. Whilst thousands of staff salaries were cut due to the effect of COVID-19, Mr. Joyce took home more than the $1.74 million he collected the previous financial year when sales were at their lowest levels. At a time when the banks are making record profits, shedding jobs and closing branches across Australia, the Commonwealth Bank has set a new benchmark for executive salaries, rewarding Chief Executive David Murray with an annual paycheck of an eye-watering $7 million. The current job seeker allowance for a single unemployed person with dependent child or children is about $16,700 a year. That's a massive gap, isn't it, between the worst off and those at the top. Now, no doubt, these wealthy people support charities and donate to many causes, and I'm not in a position to comment, but I can say that there are some people who have taken the words of the gospel to heart. Jenna Clark wrote this in the Sydney Morning Herald. She wrote, Andrew Twiggy Forrest is Australia's most generous philanthropist and staunch humanitarian, a pastoralist and mining magnate worth more than $5.2 billion. According to Forbes magazine's most recent count, Forrest recently donated $400 million of his wealth to charity, the single largest donation by a living person in Australian history. He's not finished yet either, insisting that the majority of his fortune will be given away and not left to his daughter Sophia and her siblings. Imagine what they thought about that, but nevertheless, I'm sure that they won't be on the poor list when he does eventually leave that. This is exactly what Luke is saying to us. If we're to truly follow the way of Christ, We, that's any person who claims to follow Christ, must be willing to champion the cause of the poor and disadvantaged, to view one's calling as a Christian to be more expansive. That's much wider than the confines of the church. We are being told to take our Christianity in practical ways into the world outside this building. Christians must be willing to sometimes buck traditions if they are judgmental or divisive, and to avoid those who view those traditions as infallible, willing to live a life unwilling to amass wealth on the backs of the oppressed and the unaware, to advocate for the alleviation of poverty and a living wage for all at the expense of one's own privilege, and willing to expand one's concept of family to include those whom the gospel refers to as neighbours far and near. Now that's a big ask, but it's what Jesus is saying in this story. And it's got nothing to do with hating anyone. It's about priorities. To condense the whole thing into one simple phrase, I think it's God first, all else follows. The Lord be with you. Amen.